exciting to see the people who join this space and take this work where we never took it.
Restitution is happening. There's no question there, and it's not going to stop.
For our fifth and final episode, we ask, where are we going? We're reflecting on the journey of more than 100 years of strife and dreaming a little of what is to come. Throughout this series, we've traced some of the storied paths of our ancestors, learned how they used their belongings to chronicle and celebrate their lives, to seek out spiritual direction, to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves, to play, remember their dead, and invoke blessings on their children and communities. We've come to understand that their belongings were the result of skills and practices they developed over centuries and millennia, and were a core part of how they understood themselves as people. In episode 1, we covered a history of theft, traced how our ancestors lost over 90% of their cultural belongings through punitive, ethnographic, and missionary expeditions. We learned how colonizers, missionaries, and scientists use coercion and terror to loot and outrightly destroy our belongings and defile the remains of our ancestors. Indeed, there were belongings that were freely traded, but we totally debunked any theories that any such sales could have happened to belongings considered precious and one of a kind by their owners, especially those belongings that were communally owned. In episode 2, we revealed the consistent efforts our people have made this last 100 years to demand the return of our belongings and ancestors still held by the West. We learned how they spared no expense, sometimes offering to buy back belongings, developing and deploying legal and diplomatic strategies, activating public pressure, and sometimes guerrilla tactics. Yet, at every step of the way, they were met with silence, deceit, and nuclear-grade gaslighting. We had to make episode 3 to address the history of ridiculous excuses Western governments and museums have spun, both to their nation's people and to us, in order to keep our belongings.
So there's no universal museum in Africa?
I don't think there's any universal museum anywhere. So if the British Museum says you're the universal, and your funding does not come from universal, from different countries, it comes from the British. Your laws are British. So how can you be universal?
We started by breaking the fallacy of the Universal Museum and had a lot of fun doing it too.
What does the word accessible mean in your language? Why should Africans suffer the absence of their prized belongings in order to educate you?
For me, this series has been an incredible opportunity to speak with and listen to people actively thinking about and working on restitution cases right now. Episode 4 was especially illuminating. I learned, for example, that restitution never looks the same from one community to another. I considered for the first time the meaning and purpose of the museum in an African context, finally understanding that the very concept and how it manifests in much of the continent is intrinsically tied to colonial processes. It's also in episode 4 that I began to understand how important it can be for communities, present and future, to find ways to reconnect with our belongings. Like many of you, I knew very little about restitution when this journey began, and it's been a privilege to see my own understanding and attitude shift toward curiosity. And so this episode, with some of the personalities we've met along the way, we're taking some time to reflect on how far we've come and dream a little about where we go from here and how. If you haven't watched our past episodes, please do, and join me as we think about where we need to go and the parts each of us can play to help us get there.
My understanding of restitution before I started this project was very much that it's about salvaging a particular history or salvaging culture and identity. I think there's so much work that we could do with ourselves and with others to repair a rupture that's happened in humanity. And it's exciting to see all the different ways that people are working towards that, not just necessarily negotiating a physical return, but all the other kinds of electrics of layers of repair that are happening that can be made visible.
Restitution is not only tangible. I always give it this example. I presented a paper at UJ in 2012 when I was talking about our practices, what it means to be a woman in my society, that I'm not undermined. The reason behind that presentation was I felt that if I talked about this enough, women would understand that if they know who they are within their societies, that they would thrive better because they would understand that in an African setting, they are not necessarily compromised by being born female. Of course, things were changing, women were being killed, we were taking femicide, and I was trying to find a solution. So for me, that was restitution. Who am I in a family? I'm Rakhadi. Rakhadi means a female father. It put me on the same level as my male cousins or my male brothers.
On whose terms do we engage in this work and in these conversations? On whose terms are we defining our presence in the world? The task of the thinking and the work is to make life possible, not just for myself, but for other people. And this is not out of just some benevolence, out of actually a tradition that I was born into, which emphasizes specific kinds of kinship, not just as obligatory, but as parts of world making, that we make the world, not as sort of buccaneering messianic intellectuals, but as part of communities.
The understanding of restitution has definitely evolved. It shouldn't be reduced to just conversations about things needing to come back to people, but rather it's about reclaiming a sense of dignity. It's a big question in general in knowledge production in Africa. Is this knowledge speaking to Africans from the perspective of Africans? And will it have an impact on the community or society that you're thinking about it having an impact on? Syokau and I were having this conversation the other day around experimentation on the continent, how few spaces we have for it. Being able to get comfortable with experimentation in Africa, being comfortable with trying and failing, being comfortable with finding our own ways of occupying spaces, and to not feel like we are being watched, white gaze, Western gaze. It's a hope that I have for our sector. There's no one fixed way in which we have to approach heritage or approach culture or approach museums.
What is urgent is frameworks that enable us to move forward with clear understanding of what we deserve and what we need to do. But they shouldn't just be there for the sake of being there. They should talk to our environments. They should be relatable. They should be able to take into consideration how we do things, our ways of living.
There has been some critique about things are not moving fast enough. I think that critique is from the outside. For many people who are working in restitution, we know that it needs to move slowly. The thing is that it needs to move slowly on our terms because it needs to be driven from community repair, and that community repair works at the speed of trust.
Decolonization is a long-term project. It's a project about the material of life and the material of how we imagine ourselves in the world into the future. And this is the material of land. It is the material of our health. It's the material of, climate catastrophe. It's the material of water scarcity. It's the material of being able to breathe in a toxic world.
And we might not even live to see some of the things that we worked for. but that doesn't mean that they are less important just because all the outcomes we desire don't come within our timeline. I want to see a future where restitution is not just the responsibility of artists, of museum professionals or academics, and it's everybody's business. Because even if it starts in a museum, in the sense that you're demanding what was taken from a museum, the deeper work of repair happening is work that should matter to every African. And I want to see a future where people in tech, people in economics and finance care about these questions as much as the heritage professionals and the academics and the artists. Because I think the future that we need as Africans is a future where we stop saying the work of rebuilding our nations is the work of only some people. We have to come together as Africans in our different capacities to build the Africa that we deserve.
My desire, my wish for this work and others is that, Africans in the continent, in the diaspora, have that space to express who they are in different forms and on their terms, to be sovereign beings.
We haven't solved the issue of sharing information. When we started Open Restitution Africa in 2020, it was very much as a response to this, is that people are developing knowledge through practice. People are learning very quickly on their feet and have a lot to share, and it's very difficult to get that information from one community to another, from one museum professional to another. And we haven't quite solved that. We are seeing many, many more conversations in Africa, just Africans talking to each other. And that means a kind of space of sharing that is really important, because historically it's always been conversations with a European country, for example. And that does mean that more information is being shared. But I think we need to find faster, quicker ways of ensuring that people aren't always reinventing the wheel, that people are learning about how to deal with a specific country and their specific policy things. That restitution with Germany is very different to restitution with Britain, and you have to take a very different tactic with these different places. And it just reminds me how much Africans are still having to just be super clever and respond very quickly and work under very minimal resources.
It's important for us to be able to have the evidence and the data to back up everything that we've been saying about restitution, to back up those gut feelings, that intuition that comes with the work that we do and the experiences that we have, but being able to actually lean on the data and say, this is where the evidence is taking us. These are the trends, these are the patterns.
ORA has created a really strong community of practice that is open, that is self-aware, that is transparent, that is ethical, that is progressive, really.
These concerns led the Open Restitution Africa project to develop a first-of-its-kind data platform dedicated to collating historic and contemporary African restitution case studies. The platform includes an AI-powered tool to help communities, practitioners, and culture professionals understand restitution histories and draw practical insights to ultimately support return processes. Access the platform in English or French on openrestitution.africa. Additional research will also be published in the coming months. Sign up for the Open Restitution Africa project newsletter or follow on social media to be the first to hear.
It's just going to be so exciting to see the starting point shift from the global north to Africa. We'll not start with colonization happened and then, or Macron's speech in 2017. There are publications, there is data on the work that Africans have done in restitution.
You may have heard that the Open Restitution Africa project will come to a close in 2026. I am so grateful for the opportunity to work with ORA and with my partners at Verge. I actually wrote a now award-winning magical realism short film about ancestral memory while we worked on the series. And so excited to see how the series continues to impact my work and the work of my team. Speaking of the team, did you know that the Open Restitution Africa project has been executed by an all-woman Pan-African team who've worked from across and beyond the continent to connect the diversity of Africans working toward restitution? And as it happens, most of our key personnel on this production were also women. I'm so grateful for the beautiful collaboration I've experienced across our teams, including the men who have been strong enough to lend their skills to the work. As Syokau has said, it's going to take all of us working together to create the Africa that we deserve. That means you too. So join in wherever you are. Let's go. And this is where our paths diverge. In the comments, I'd love to hear how you are taking this work forward. My name is Ngwatilo Mawiyoo. I'll leave the last word to our series creator.
My name is Molemo Moiloa, and I am one of the co-founders, together with Chow Tayana Maina, of Open Restitution Africa. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. This is the end of episode 5 and the end of the full series of Restitution 101. It's been an incredible learning process for us, and we hope for you too. Goodbye.
Yeah, my message to our own communities is that they should pick interest to look for objects that they are missing in their communities. If you don't have access, inform us as museum curators. We will work together to make sure that some of the objects that you really need in your community and that they are missing, they can be accessible to you. I want to see the future of restitution being talked at schools as a mandatory issue, so that by the time they become ministers or they become policymakers, we don't struggle to explain.